This is a quick video on one of the basics of editing, spotting the subject, verb, and object of a sentence. The goals are to introduce you really briefly to why recognizing SVO is useful, review the basics of sentence structure, and prepare you for more specific lessons in punctuating sentences to avoid run-ons and fragments. Now, punctuation gives a lot of us fits. We have a hard time remembering the rules. We have a hard time seeing the punctuation that's a problem in sentences. But the point of good punctuation is to make each sentence clear and easy to read. Grammatical rules actually help us do that. They're not just little gotcha points. And subjects and verbs have to agree in number. We need to know whether we have a clause or a phrase so we can punctuate clearly. If we mess that up, we wind up with awkward run-on sentences and sentence fragments, and let's not do that. Now, before we tackle fragments and run-ons and where to put commas and where not to put them, here's a fundamental thing about writing clear sentences. You have to have a good handle on the subject, the verb, and the object. Man bites dog, the most basic news sentence there is. So let's start there, because the easiest sentences to read come in the form of subject-verb-object. Again, a noun does something to another noun. Here's a sentence. Those votes infuriated members of Congress from the Northeast of both parties and their constituents. It has a subject-verb-object structure with a couple of other wrinkles, but let's stick with the SVO issue here. The subject is usually going to be a noun. In this case, it's votes. You can also say that those votes as a phrase is the subject. Subject comes right up front at the start of the sentence. It's followed immediately by the simple active verb infuriated. The object of the sentence, which is a direct object, is a little more complicated, but no big deal. Think of it this way. The action of the verb infuriated happened to members of Congress and their constituents. It's a two-part object with the added information thrown in that there's lawmakers from the Northeast and an aside that the lawmakers were from both parties. A pretty simple sentence. Let's take another one from the same story. Tuesday's Sandy aid package, for example, included roughly $12 billion for the Federal Emergency Management Agency, the nation's primary conduit for disaster response. That looks a little tougher, but it isn't. The subject is package, or you could include the entire phrase with words modifying package, Tuesday's Sandy aid package. But package is the center of the subject. For example, is an aside set off in commas. It's not part of the SVO. The verb included in the direct object, $12 billion, or roughly $12 billion. The rest of the sentence is related info, but it's not per se part of the SVO skeleton. Sentences are harder to understand when they start with something before the subject. Usually that's a phrase with a preposition such as of, in, to, with, and a whole long list. You can look that up on the web and see hundreds of prepositions. You'll recognize all of them. They're very common. Or the sentence could start with a phrase having a participle, words that end in ing, or words that end in ed. Not going to get into it, but a participle is a verb part. I'm going to point them out, though. Prepositional and participial phrases bury the subject deeper into the sentence, and we need to dig out the subject. A short prepositional phrase starts this sentence. From 2004 to 2011, the Government Accountability Office found Kansas took more than $1.2 billion in relief for natural disasters. The sentence has an aside set off in commas, with the subject of the sentence finally coming along. Kansas. How do we know the subject is Kansas? Because it's Kansas that took, and took is our verb. The object, it's direct. It's $1.2 billion. After that, some more information about the money and a couple of quick phrases. What kind of phrases are those? Well, They use in and for, which are prepositions, so they're prepositional phrases. But the subject, verb, and object hold the sentence together. Kansas took more than $1.2 billion. While we're on SVO, let's pay attention to the two kinds of objects. I've mentioned that the examples we've looked at have direct objects. But if the object leads off with a preposition, it's known as an indirect object. Example, most of that cash went to local governments to defray the costs of cleanup and rebuilding that might ordinarily fall on local taxpayers. Subject, cash, went, which is the verb, to local governments. So that's an indirect object because of to leading off the object. Then the sentence adds information about the purpose of the cash. Still all good. Sentence starts out with a clear SVO though. And let me make it clear that we want to be clear.